Welcome everyone to our Transcend webinar for teachers. If you are an administrator, of course, you are welcome to be in this session. We did have 2 webinars last week for administrator training that we will be sending out, but this one is just the teacher view, and we welcome all of you today. We know it's the start of school for a lot of you, so we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us. We're going to get started with just a few introductions, but first thing, in the chat, I just put the presentation we're going to be working off of today. And at any point during the session today, please feel free to unmute and ask your questions or put them in the chat. We will be monitoring that, and we are here to help you. We have several participants today. So if you don't mind just putting in the chat where you are from, your PSU or your charter, just so we know who we have with us today. But with that, I'll go ahead and start with myself. I'm Rebecca Stokes. I am the Professional Development Specialist with DPI, Product Manager for Schoolnet. Just started. This is my second month in this position. So I'm so excited to be working with Transcend and with Schoolnet and with all of you this upcoming school year. So welcome. And I'm going to have Jeff and Caleb introduce themselves, and I believe Catherine is on our call as well today. So if you guys could introduce yourself while I start sharing.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rebecca. My name's Jeff Hauger. I work here at Pearson. I'm the director of Transcend. My background is I have a doctorate in psychometrics. I started in a district as being the test administrator, worked with the test coordination. I did that for about 5 years. And then I became the director of assessments for the state of New Jersey. And I held that role for about 8.5, 9 years. And then I found myself interested in formative assessments, and that's how I found myself over here working with Pearson. So happy to be with you today.
Hey, I'm Caleb Nugent. I am the project manager for Transcend. I've been doing this for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I was a project and implementation manager for Schoolnet for about 6 years. So pretty familiar with the products that you guys have been using there as part of your home base. And I'm happy to be working with you today. I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Catherine Simone. I am your implementation manager for Schoolnet, but feel free to reach out for Transcend if you need any assistance.
Perfect. Thank you. And it looks like we have several from Quest Academy with us today. Thank you for joining us. And we have someone from the College Preparatory and Leadership Academy from Jamestown. So thank you all for joining with us. And I'm going to put that presentation in the chat again and turn it over to Jeff.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. So today we're going to be talking about Transcend, but before we get to what Transcend is, I think it's good to sort of go over the different types of assessments that students encounter throughout a school year. Here we have a list of a formative assessment, interim assessment, and summative assessments. And right now, the definitions of what these are sort of is a little bit blurred. But when we talk about Transcend, we talk about Transcend as being an interim assessment. And so I just want to go over how we sort of define what these different assessments are and their purposes. The thing that separates these three different types of assessments are really the granularity and the frequency. And when we talk about the granularity, it talks about how large or small of the content that you are measuring. With formative assessments, it's usually something very specific. It could be a standard, it could be a lesson plan, but usually it's very targeted in nature. And obviously the formative assessments happen more frequently. The formative assessments can happen before you provide a lesson or go over a standard just to see what kind of pre-knowledge students have. It could happen during the lesson if you have a whole week's worth of instruction plan to see how students are grasping certain concepts before you move on, or it could sort of happen at the end. But essentially these formative assessments are really actionable, and you can really turn on a dime in terms of understanding where students are and where they need to be. Interim assessments, which Transcend is a little larger granularity, so it's over multiple standards essentially. and it happens a little less frequently than formative assessments. Typically, as Transcend, it happens 3 times per year. Again, we've heard of interim assessments usually talked about as benchmarks, measuring student success, evaluating ongoing programs, informing teacher and improving learning, and predicting in some cases how well students will do on the summative assessment, which leads us to the largest type of assessment in terms of granularity, and the least frequent, which is a summative assessment. Typically, this measures everything, all the standards that students were supposed to learn over the course of the year, and it happens once at the end of the year as sort of a capstone assessment. All right, next slide, please. Oh, so this is just a visual representation of a student walking into a classroom and the different types of assessments. It's really a visual of what we're just talking about. Typically they receive formative classroom assessments first, and this happens throughout the process of a year, given more frequently. And then every so often they get an interim assessment, and obviously the culmination of the summative assessment at the end. All right, next slide, please. So as we talked about, Transcend is an interim assessment for math and reading in grades 3 through 8. There's 3 aspects of Transcend that we'll sort of talk about today. There's the intelligent blueprint that aligns to local curriculum maps. And this is what separates Transcend from other interim assessments. And what I mean by that is that at the district level, the district administrator is able to select standards that the students have been or should have been instructed on for the last 6 to 10 weeks or so. And then for interim 2, it's the same thing. And by interim 3, all the assessment standards should be reviewed and assessed. So unlike other assessments where it's essentially just one blueprint and it's all the assessments, and over time they're given that same blueprint 3 times a year, this one is really just based on what students have been instructed on, and then they're assessed. So there's that linkage between instruction and assessment, and students shouldn't ever be tested on a standard that they haven't been instructed on. And obviously with the blueprint, this allows that flexibility. The calibrated item bank, as we'll talk about and we'll get into it, Transcend is an adaptive test, which means that the items will adapt to how well students are performing on the test. If the student's doing well, then they'll get more difficult items. If the student isn't doing as well, they'll get a little bit easier items, and we'll get more into that a little later. And of course, we have dynamic, user-friendly set of reports. So there are a bunch of reports that are available, and I think timeliness is something in terms of how critical it is to be able to use it in the classroom important. And I'll just let you with a little secret here. Transcend reports are typically available the day of when the student takes assessment, and usually we usually say within 24 hours for sure those reports will be available. All right, next slide, please. So this is what the Intelligent Test Blueprint looks like. As a classroom teacher, you will not set the blueprint. That is what the test administrator will do. Hopefully they will give you guidance in terms of what standards have been selected, and it's a process that you work with them. But this is something that this is the screen, and this is how they would select those. It's a real easy interface to work with. For example, in interim 1, this is math grade 3, interim 1, all the bubbles will be unfilled. So they'll look like, they'll just be white bubbles with numbers in them. If you want to select a standard, you just click on that bubble and it becomes dark purple. So in this example, in interim 1, we see that for operations and algebraic thinking, 1 through 8 have been selected. And numbers and operations 1 and 2, and for measurement and data 5 through 8. So that would be interim 1 in this example. Now, as you go to interim 2, you see that those standards that have been selected in interim 1 are now light purple. And that means that those standards that were on interim 1 can be assessed on interim 2. We have this concept called a cumulative framework, which means that students, once the student has been instructed on it and assessed, that they can get assessed on those standards as time goes by. So you can't do anything with the light purple buttons. They're there because they were selected in interim 1 and they just go into interim 2. And then you select the standards that have been instructed on between interim 1 and interim 2, and those will be the focus for interim 2 and will be in the dark purple. And then as you see, as you get to interim 3, all the standards should be selected, and the new standards that have been introduced and worked on with students between interim 2 and interim 3 are dark purple, and again, all the light purple are the previous standards that students have been assessed on. All right, next slide, please. So the Transcend Item Bank, there's a couple key important points here, is that the Transcend Item Bank is aligned to North Carolina content standards. There are a range of item types. Now, since this is an adaptive test and the test adapts based on how students perform, all the items are machine scoreable, right? So student punches in their answer and then the computer says if it's right or wrong, and that will determine what the next item is. So they're all machine scoreable. However, I don't want to give you an impression that they're all multiple choice. Now, a fair number of items are multiple choice items, but we do have different item types to measure the construct. For example, in math, we have some equation editor items. So students have to fill in an equation to be able to get the answer right. We do have some fill in the blank items. For example, I might say, what is 5 plus 5? And there'll be a blank. And so the student has to fill out, do the math, and then in the blank, put 10. So they are all machine scoreable, but they're not all multiple choice. That's just something I just wanted to make sure we all understood. Our items are thoroughly reviewed by content and editorial specialists for bias, equity, and such. And we have had North Carolina educators review our item bank as well. Reading items are largely passage-based, which means the reading test, there's usually 2 to 3 passages, and the majority of items are based on those passages. Now, there are a couple items that are just independent, which means that it may just be a sentence or a quick 2 lines of what a student reads, and then they have to respond to it. And essentially, that ensures that the passage that is selected for the student measures is competent with what the student knows and can learn. So in order to sort of give us an idea of where the students are, there's some independent items, and then the difficulty of the passage is selected. Items obviously are intended to be efficient and focus on measuring the construct, and we do this, as we talked about, by having the items aligned to North Carolina standards, and also having a different range of item types. All right, next slide, please. So we've talked about this concept, and the Transcend Interim Assessment is adapted for each student. So the benefits here are efficiency, right? So the intelligent blueprint really adapts to the student. So at the beginning of the school year, if you have a 4th grader taking a math test, all students start at the same point. However, as they progress through interim 1, they take different paths. So a student who starts doing really well will start getting a little bit more difficult items, to really challenge a student. A student that isn't doing so well in interim 1 will get a little less difficult items, trying to challenge them to see where they're at. So students take a different path. Now that path at the end of interim 1 is where they pick up and start at interim 2. And then however well they do on interim 2, if a student is doing well in interim 1 and continues to do well in interim 2, then that's the starting point for interim 3. So throughout the year, the student's path, it is the starting point for interim 2 is where they'll end on interim 1. And so throughout the year, it measures that. Now, it's not over years. So once they go to grade 5, in this example, the grade 5 math students all start at the same point again, and then they build their own paths throughout the course of the year. Obviously, an advantage of this cumulative framework that we talked about, that I just explained, is that it takes and leverages students' data on how well they've performed in previous assessments and how well they've performed during the test, from one test to the next. And obviously, the item difficulty varies based on student responses. So this is an important concept in terms of you know, the test is adapted to each item, because it really makes us have, you know, a shorter amount of time for the test. Each test is approximately, you know, 60 minutes, and there's no more than 30 items. However, I can tell you, depending upon how many standards are assessed in interim one, that test could be much shorter. You know, in terms of the students responding to it, could only take 20 to 30 minutes, and the student may only see 15 items, depending upon how many are in interim one. The length of the test does get longer as you go interim two and interim three, because we have that cumulative framework, so more standards are being assessed. But we do have limits in terms of the time, and most students, the majority, 99%, finish well within that 60-minute time frame. All right, next slide, please. So just to hammer this home and just sort of give the idea, as you know, we put this on the slide. So as the student progresses through the test, the CAT algorithm will develop statistically easier or statistically harder items within grade level. And that's an important concept as well, is if a student's really struggling in grade 4 math, the items will be easier, but it will stay on grade 4 standards. So students will not, you know, go down to grade 3 standards. Likewise, if a student's doing really well in grade 4 math, they won't go into grade 5 math. It will just stay there, and the items within the standards that are being measured, that is where the difficulty level will adjust. And as we said, you know, if a student is measured on a standard in interim one, they may be measured that same standard on interim 3. Now, the difficulty of the item in interim 3 may be different than interim 1. And even so, students that see items on interim 1, once they see an item, like if they see 5 plus 5 in our math example, they won't see that same item in interim 2 or interim 3, even if that same standard is measured. So they'll always see unique items, which is something to think about too. So once they see that item, they won't see it again for the rest of the year. All right, next slide, please. So there's a bunch of accommodations students can have on test: item answer masking, color contrast, line reader, magnification, Spanish and math, and text-to-speech. Next slide, please. So we have a bunch of reports that are available. We have student level reports, session rosters reports, class summary reports, and school and district overview reports. Now, I'm going to go into and just show you an overview of what these reports look like and just give you a brief overview, but I do want to let you know that we will go more in depth into the reports later on, probably in October, November. I'm not sure we have it scheduled yet, just to go in more in depth on how to interpret and analyze these reports. One of the most important features of the reports, as I talked about, is really timeliness, right? Being able to understand how students are performing as quickly as possible. You know, obviously you don't want students to take a test in October and get and reports, you know, back in December. So these reports are, like we talked about, are usually available the same day. In worst case scenario, usually 24 hours later is the max. All right, so let's go take a look at these reports real quick. So this is what the reports look like. They are a little bit different than probably what you've typically seen in terms of reports. This is a classroom report. There's a couple things here to note. One thing is that to Transcend scale, regardless of grade level or subject area, is 300 to 500. In the far left corner, you see the math, the overall scale score for how well the class did. And then you have a standard error, you have a standard deviation next to that, which is plus 50. So that's the variability within the class. And then if you go over, you see what domains were assessed on this assessment, and there's a scale score for that as well. Now, if you go down and you see the graph here, it's how the distribution of students performed on that test. So this is based on the frequency of students within each level. So in this case, we see that there are 5 different colors. There's 5 performance levels, and each color represents a performance level. So you have the dark blue, which is level 5, which is the highest. And then you have the green color, which is level 4. And then you have the yellow color, which is level 3, and the orange level 2, and the red level 1. And then over on the other side, you have the domains, and you have the distribution of how students performed in each domain as well. Next slide, please. And this is your status roster report. This is your session roster report. So on the left, you see all your students' names. You have the performance level that they are in. You have the overall math score and each domain. And these are, you can click on these and you can sort them by highest performance level to lowest. You click on them from highest math score to lowest math score, and you can do that with each domain as well. This is very helpful if you want to look at grouping students for math, or just looking at, you know, overall how well students are doing and what their strengths and weaknesses are for each domain. All right, next slide, please. This is a individual student report. Again, you have their overall math score with a standard error of measurement, their performance level category, and their domain score for each domain. And then it's graphically represented. And again, it shows you what performance level they're in. Now, you know, just a little highlight here is, you know, the 413 is where the student score was. And sometimes, you know, educators, teachers like to know, well, great, is that a high, you know, is that predicted to be a high level 4, a low level 4? How close are they? You know, sometimes, you know, they want to see if they're close to the next performance level category or whatnot. And this visually sort of represents that. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. So one of the things, next slide, please. And then, of course, as you progress through the year and the student has taken 3 different assessments, you can go and you can show their performance on all 3 interim assessments in one click. And so you can click on it, it says show more, you click on it, and then it'll say show less. And this shows you the performance from interim 1 to interim 2, and interim 3, and how they've progressed or what their performance has been like over time. And you can do the same over there with the domains. All right, next slide. One of the things that we heard loud and clear from educators was that, you know, we had the domain scale scores, we had the overall math scale scores, and they wanted the information to be more granular. Is there a way that we could provide student level information um, at standard level? And so what we did is we created this item mapping report. And this item mapping report shows how well students have performed on the items that they were administered and the difficulty associated with them. So for instance, in this example, we have one student in assessment 1, you have the item number, and that is how the item number represents when that item was shown to the student. So in this case, the first item is 12. So that's the 12th item the student received. You can sort by item number. So if you want to see students 1 through 20 and how the students, you know, progressed from item 1 all the way through 20, you can look at that. This one right now, as you see, sort by, it's by standard. So it sorts by standard. So you can see in this example, the student received 2 items for operations, algebraic thinking, standard 1, got 1 wrong, got 1 right. And so this organizes by that. And as we just talked about, you know, the correctness is below that, where the red X represents the student got it wrong, and the green check mark means the student got it right. And then below that is the difficulty of the item. And that's something important to take in consideration. You know, did the student, you know, do well with low or medium difficulty items, and then all of a sudden got a really difficult one and missed it? So there's a lot of interpretation here, and this provides a little more information at the student level. Now, obviously, one of the questions that we get is, you know, can we have a report like this at the classroom level? And we are working on that, but we just have to make sure that we understand that, like, you know, although all the students are taking the same standards, they're not necessarily taking the same item. And so, you know, this OA.1 for this student could be very different than another student within the classroom, because not all students within your classroom may be taking the same items. All right. So with that, I think I am turning it over to
Can I
Caleb.
interrupt you really
Yeah.
quick, Jeff? There is
Yeah.
a question in the chat about asking if you will be able to see the item questions.
Right. So you will not be able to see the item questions with the Transcend for two reasons. One, it's a secure item bank, and second is what we're just sort of discussing is that for each student, since they won't be seeing the same items, it will be a lot of different items that we would have to release in a classroom for it to make sense. So that's the important aspect here is that within a classroom, students may see many different items. They're not all taking the same number of, or the same exact item. All right, Caleb, turn it over to you.
Sure, sounds good. This part is easy, just showing you how to access the reports once you have some data in there. So let me share my screen with you. And I'm assuming that this may look familiar to you. This is your homepage in home-based Schoolnet. So once you have data and you're ready to access it, if you just go to the existing reporting dashboard, click on reporting over here on the left, you'll have a new tab here called Transcend Reports. And when you click that, it's going to show you for whichever subjects and grades you're teaching. If you teach multiples, you can just use these drop-down selectors to navigate to the correct one. But that's where your reports will live. And as your students start taking tests, it'll become more colorful, like the examples Jeff was showing you. This one doesn't have a lot of data in here, but this is where the reports live. You can drill down to the students by clicking on the number of students tested link here. And that's where you'll see the list of students for this particular class. And click on the name of a student to see that student's individual report. So accessing them is super easy, just a reporting dashboard tab called Transcend Reports. So I think you won't have any problem accessing that. And I think Jeff may have mentioned earlier that we'll do another deep dive into the reporting once you have data in there to look at. So you may have some questions about how to interpret the data or other reporting questions we'll go over with you. So just want to make sure you know how to get to them so that when you're in your test window, you can start looking at them. But I think for the teachers, the important thing to know is you don't have to create these assessments. You don't have to schedule these assessments. You're really just looking at the reporting once students take them. The process should be that whoever at the district is creating these test blueprints and scheduling them out should provide you with a test passcode for your grade and subject that you're teaching that you can give to the students so that when they log into their account and they take a test widget on their homepage, they can put that passcode to take the test. And then when they complete them, you should be able to come in and see the reports. So that's really it in a nutshell of how to get to the reports in Schoolnet. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any on that. Otherwise, I'll just turn it back over to Rebecca and we'll see if there's any other questions.
Just in case someone is unaware, can you show where the students will enter in that passcode?
So Caleb, they're just putting the passcode in the same place we would for Schoolnet, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
Yep.
So the passcode, this is the DPI training site. So this is not set up for Transcend, just to let everybody know, but same passcode from the Transcend test, you're going to put right here, click go. Just a reminder, it pops up in a new window, so make sure you don't have a pop-up blocker on your browser, and then the students will be all set to go.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine.
Yep.
And as Jeff and Caleb mentioned, we are going to have another webinar in October after everyone has been able to get some data so that when we are going over those data reports, you're able to look at yours as well. So just know that we will be having a follow-up session. But if anyone has a question, we are here and ready. So I'll leave that for just a moment. But let me go back here. So you have our contact information. It is on the screen. You can, of course, email us at any time with any questions about Transcend that you may have. We are happy to help. And I'll be sending out the information about those October webinars in the SIS bulletin and in the Schoolnet bulletin. So if you are not subscribed to those, please let me know. You can email me or put something in the chat if you would like to get subscribed to those notifications. Be happy to share that with you. But if there are no questions, then that is all that we have for you today. Just quick overview, but we are going to hang out for a few minutes for anyone that might have a question that they think of in the next few minutes. But we thank you for taking time out of your day to join us, and we hope you have a great start of the new school year.